Agotavech everyone, we are continuing in today's Mishna Yomi. Shabbos is Mishna Yomi, which is Peah, Perek Dalid, Mishnayis, Vav through Zayin. Mishnah Vav, Mishnah 6 says as follows: Obi kochavim shekatzer sadehu, the acher kach nisgayer. An interesting case. If you have a non-Jew who harvested his field, and after harvesting his field, he converted, what's the halacha? Patra min haleket umin hashichacha umin hapeah. He is exempt from leket. Leket is the halacha that if you're harvesting your grain and you drop a stalk, you have to leave it there. Shichacha is if you leave behind a bundle, you have to leave it for the poor. And peah, of course, is leaving the corner of the field. So the truth is, this is not really a chiddush, because what the Mishnah is saying over here is as follows. All of these obligations, these tithing obligations, or we'll call it tzedakah obligations, as they apply to grain, are all situations, are pretty much all incurred at the time of harvest. So in this case over here, when the farmer was not Jewish at the time of the harvesting, pretty much the crop will be exempt from all of these obligations. Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv b'shichacha, she'ena shichacha ela b'shasim. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says that halacha l'maisa, in this case, the grain will be chayiv in shichacha, which is the halacha that if you forget a bundle, you have to go ahead and leave it for the poor. And the reason he says it is because the obligation for shichacha really only comes about at the time that the grain is piled. And since, again, by the time the grain is piled up, ultimately the individual is Jewish, therefore halacha l'maisa is chayiv in shichacha. Now, interestingly enough, the Bar Tanura says, ve'in halacha k'Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore again, halacha l'maisa, we pass like the first opinion in the Mishnah, namely that all of the obligations, leket, shichacha, and peah, are all incurred, or really all come about at the time of harvest. Therefore, if the farmer is not Jewish at the time of harvest, none of these obligations apply. Mishnah Zayin. Hikdish kama upada kama chayiv. An interesting case. What happens if I'm a farmer and I have a grain field, and while my grain is still standing, I go ahead and I consecrate my field. Meaning, I go ahead and I give it over to the Beis HaMikdash. Now, I consecrate the field when the grain is standing and attached. That's what kama means. Kama means that halacha l'maisa, the grain is still standing. So I consecrate when the grain is still standing, upada kama, and I subsequently redeem it from the Beis HaMikdash before any harvest has taken place. Chayiv, then obviously now I harvested it and still standing grain. I redeemed it and it's still standing grain. When I harvest it, I will be chayiv, obligated in leket, shichacha, and peah. Amorin upada amorin. Similarly, again, let's say I harvested my grain and I put it into bundles, and then I consecrated everything, and then I subsequently redeemed it while it is still in bundles. Chayiv. In this case, again, the grain will be subject to leket and shichacha and peah. And the logic here is very simple, because at the time of harvesting, remember again, it was my grain. Therefore, the obligations of leket, shichacha, and peah were incurred. The fact that I subsequently consecrated it and then redeemed it doesn't take away the obligation. Incredible. What about kama upada amarin? Listen to the following case. So let's say I go ahead and I consecrate my grain while it was kama, still standing attached to the ground. So I consecrate it, goes over to the Beis HaMikdash, and then what happens? Subsequently, the Beis HaMikdash, they harvested the grain. And they bundled it. I now redeemed the grain when it's bundles, ptura. Ultimately, the grain is pata from leket, shichacha, and peah. Why? Shebishas chovaso haisa petura. Interestingly enough, because the Mishnah explains at the time when the obligation was incurred, ultimately, again, it was pater. Now, interestingly enough, there's a very interesting idea over here to contemplate, which is as follows. You see, in this unique case, what's unfolding over here is the following. In this case, I went ahead and I gave it over to the Beis HaMikdash at the time that it was standing grain. Okay, the Beis HaMikdash, we'll call it, I'm referring to the Beis HaMikdash, harvested the grain, bundled the grain. Now I redeem it from the Beis HaMikdash, and I redeem it, and it's in its bundled form. So the Mishnah says, in this case, Petura, the produce is exempt from leket, shichacha, and peah. And the reason for that is as follows, because remember, the theme over here is the same. The obligation for leket, shichacha, and peah devolves upon the grain at the time of harvest. See, there's an important halacha to know over here, which is grain that is owned by the Beis Hamikdash is exempt from any tithing or charitable obligations, which makes sense. Like at Shechicha and Peah, which are all forms of charity, all forms of tithing, ultimately, again, are only applicable to privately owned grain. But anything owned by the Beis Hamikdash is exempt from all of these items. Therefore, the Mishnah says over here that essentially, if the Beis Hamikdash went ahead and harvested the grain, and then I redeemed it from this, so therefore, again, at the time of harvest, it belonged to the Beis Hamikdash. Therefore, it is not subject to leket, shechacha, and peah. Incredible. We will stop over here for today. Wishing everyone a good tevach, and we will continue our tomorrow with Mishnah, Ches, and Tes.